The air in the conduit was dead. Not merely still, but stripped of all life, a sterile vacuum that tasted of recycled oxygen and cold, dormant metal. Asset 734 clung to the magnetized grating, his body a flat, efficient line against the durasteel. Below, the Warlord's command nexus pulsed with a low, predatory hum, the thrum of servers processing kill vectors, the whisper of ventilation systems breathing life into a fortress carved from a dead mountain. The light was a sterile, unforgiving silver, glinting off the polished obsidian floor 60 feet below, a sheer drop into the heart of the beast. He was a ghost in this machine, his biosuit a second skin of matte black polymers that drank the light and muffled the sound of his own heartbeat, a rhythm suppressed to the slow, steady beat of a metronome. His scent, the great liability of his subgender, was a chemical nullity, scrubbed from his pores by a regimen of injections and nullifiers that left his skin feeling like parchment. He was an absence, a void shaped like a man, and he was here to create another. The target was General Kalen, the alpha of the Ashfall clans, a man who built an empire from dust and defiance. The Directorate's briefings had painted him in strokes of brutal simplicity, a savage, an ideologue, a butcher who did not take prisoners. The hollows showed a man carved from the same stone as his fortress, with eyes that held the flat, cold light of a winter sky. Asset 734's mission was as simple as the man's description. Infiltrate, access, terminate. A microfilament dart, no thicker than a hair, was chambered in the deployment unit on his wrist. It carried a neurotoxin that would unravel the Warlord's nervous system in 0.7 seconds. A clean, clinical termination, the Directorate's signature. He shifted his weight, the magnetic soles of his boots releasing and gripping with a sound so faint it was lost in the thrum of the nexus. The primary ventilation shaft was just ahead, his entry point. His conditioning was a cool, clean wall in his mind, a structure of pure logic. Emotion was a variable, and variables were liabilities. Fear was a chemical reaction to be neutralized. Hope was a logical fallacy. He was not a person. He was an instrument, calibrated for a single, precise function. He had performed this function 17 times. This would be the 18th. He reached the shaft, the grating cool beneath his gloved fingers. The schematics he had memorized, a psychic echo ripped from the mind of a captured engineer, were a perfect three-dimensional map in his mind's eye. He saw the ducts, the power lines, the pressure sensors. He saw his path. A soft click, and the grate lifted. The air that washed over him was different here. It was alive. It carried the scent of hot metal, of ozone from the server cores, and something else, something organic, primal. It was the scent of the enemy, the scent of an alpha. His conditioning flared, a cold wave of revulsion and focus. He slipped into the shaft, a shadow flowing into deeper darkness. The descent was silent, a controlled fall through a metallic gullet. He moved with a liquid grace that was the product of thousands of hours of simulated and physical training. His body was not his own. It was a Directorate asset, honed to peak efficiency. He emerged into a smaller maintenance conduit running parallel to the command floor, separated from it by a one-way chroma glass panel. He was directly above the nexus. Below him, the scene was one of stark, brutalist order. Figures in grey uniforms moved with disciplined haste around a massive holographic dais that projected a swirling map of contested territories in blood red and cobalt blue. And in the center, standing alone, was him, General Kalen. He was larger than the hollows had suggested, a presence that seemed to warp the very air around him, drawing all light and attention to his form. He wore a simple black uniform, devoid of rank or ornamentation, yet his authority was absolute. It radiated from him, a palpable pressure that Asset 734 could feel even through the reinforced glass. Kalen was listening to a subordinate, his head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. His stillness was what was most unsettling. It was not passive. It was the stillness of a predator, coiled and waiting. Asset 734 raised his wrist. He did not need to aim. The suit's integrated targeting system had already painted a microscopic red dot on the Warlord's temple. He had to wait for the subordinate to move away. Collateral damage was inefficient. He exhaled slowly, his breath misting for a fraction of a second in the cold air. The subordinate bowed his head and retreated. Kalen was alone. The moment was perfect, clean, clinical. Asset 734's finger twitched over the deployment stud. And then the Warlord looked up. He did not scan the ceiling. He did not search. His eyes, the color of frozen water, lifted and locked directly onto the chroma glass panel, onto the precise spot where Asset 734 was concealed. It was impossible. The panel was polarized. The conduit was light-sealed. He was a ghost, a nullity. But the Warlord saw him. Asset 734 felt a sensation his conditioning had no name for. It was a cold, sharp spike that pierced the clean wall of his logic. His programming screamed, "Compromised, terminate, now!" He pressed the stud. There was no sound, only the faintest hiss of compressed air. The filament dart, invisible to the naked eye, shot towards its target. Kalen did not flinch. He did not move. He simply tilted his head, a motion of almost casual curiosity. The dart, meant for his temple, struck the reinforced collar of his uniform and shattered into a harmless puff of crystallized toxin. An alarm blared, a deep, resonant clang that vibrated through the floor. Red lights strobed across the nexus, bathing everything in a bloody glow. The Warlord's guards were moving, weapons raised, but Kalen didn't look at them. He kept his gaze fixed on the ceiling, on the ghost he should not have been able to see. A slow, chilling smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of amusement. It was a smile of confirmation. Asset 734's mind was a maelstrom of failed parameters. Mission failure, egress protocol. He was already moving, retracting back into the shaft, a phantom retreating into the dark. But the fortress was no longer dormant. It was awake, and it was hunting him. Hatches slammed shut. Electrical currents surged through the walls of the conduit, forcing him back. He could feel psychic probes, crude but powerful, sweeping through the vents, searching for his signature. He suppressed his own psychic presence, pulling it inward until it was a tiny, cold spark. But they were everywhere. He was cornered. His training offered two options: self-termination or capture. Capture was not an option. The Directorate did not lose assets. He reached for the cyanide capsule embedded in his molar. And then a voice echoed through the conduits, not over a speaker, but directly in his mind. It was deep, resonant, and laced with an authority that bypassed his conditioning and struck something deeper, something dormant. There is nowhere to run, little ghost. It was Kalen's voice, not spoken, but projected, a raw, undisciplined display of psychic power. It was brutish. It was effective. The floor beneath him gave way. He dropped, landing with a trained roll on the cold obsidian of the command nexus. He was instantly surrounded, the barrels of a dozen pulse rifles aimed at his head. He remained in a crouch, poised, his gaze fixed on the only man who mattered. General Kalen walked toward him, his heavy boots making no sound on the polished floor. The guards parted before him like water. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at the black-clad asset. The pressure of his presence was immense, a physical weight that made the recycled air feel thick and hard to breathe. "The Directorate grows desperate," Kalen said, his voice as calm as it had been in Asset 734's mind. "They send their phantoms to do their killing now, so clean, so clinical." He crouched, moving with a fluid grace that was unnerving in a man his size. He was close enough now that Asset 734 could see the fine lines around his eyes, the flecks of grey in his dark hair. The scent of him was overwhelming. Ozone, cold stone, and something wild and musky that the nullifiers couldn't fully mask. It was the scent of a dominant alpha. It made the asset's skin crawl with a biological revulsion he had been trained to master. "What is your designation?" Kalen asked. Silence. Asset 734's orders were clear. In the event of capture, no name, no rank, no information. Only termination. His jaw tightened, preparing to crush the capsule. Kalen's eyes narrowed. "No," he said, the word a soft command. He reached out, his gloved hand moving with impossible speed, and gripped Asset 734's jaw. His grip was like iron. "I think not." He forced the asset's head back, his thumb pressing hard against the hinge of his jaw. There was a sickening pop as it dislocated. Pain, white-hot and blinding, flared through Asset 734's mind, shattering his focus. The cyanide capsule remained intact. Kalen released him. Asset 734 slumped, cradling his broken jaw, the pain a roaring ocean in his head. "We do not play their games here," Kalen said, his voice dropping low. He turned to his captain. "What is the standing order?" The captain's voice was clipped, certain. "No prisoners, General." "Correct," Kalen said, his gaze returning to the crumpled figure on the floor. He looked at Asset 734, not with hatred, but with a strange, analytical curiosity. He took in the slender frame, the unnatural stillness, the complete absence of scent. His eyes lingered on the pulse point of the asset's neck, where the skin was pale and translucent. A long, silent moment passed. The entire command nexus held its breath. Asset 734 waited for the killing shot. It was the logical conclusion. Termination. He closed his eyes, but the shot never came. Instead, he felt strong arms slide under his back and knees. He was lifted effortlessly from the floor. His eyes snapped open in shock. He was being held in the Warlord's arms, his head resting against the hard plate of Kalen's uniform. The pain in his jaw was a distant throb compared to the sheer, disorienting wrongness of the situation. This was not in any simulation. This was not a parameter he could process. General Kalen looked at his stunned captain, his expression unyielding. "The order stands," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the Nexus. "I don't take prisoners." He started walking, carrying the Directorate's ghost as if he weighed nothing, moving away from the assembled soldiers and towards the dark corridor that led to his private chambers. His words hung in the air, a declaration and a contradiction, a promise of death that felt terrifyingly like something else entirely. He was deposited not on the cold flagstones of a cell, but on a surface that yielded slightly beneath his weight. Fabric, coarse, woven wool. The room was a study in brutalist minimalism, carved from the same dark, volcanic rock as the rest of the fortress. There was a bed, more of a stone slab with a thin mattress and a pile of furs, a metal desk, and a single, tall window of armored glass that looked out not upon a sky, but upon the molten heart of the mountain, a river of lava that flowed in a silent, incandescent ribbon deep within the earth. The light in the room was a dim, pulsing orange, the light of a dying star. It was a tomb. It was a throne room. Asset 734 pushed himself up, his dislocated jaw throbbing with a nauseating rhythm. The pain was a grounding anchor in the sea of his confusion. General Kalen stood by the door, watching him with that same unnerving stillness. He had removed his gloves, and his hands were bare, large and calloused. He had not disarmed him. The dart launcher was still on his wrist, his suit still held a vibro knife in its sheath, and the cyanide capsule was still a bitter promise in his mouth. It was a tactical oversight so glaring it had to be deliberate, a test or a statement. "Can you reset it yourself?" Kalen's voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Asset 734 stared at him, saying nothing. His conditioning was fractured, but still held. Do not engage. Do not communicate. "I assume your directorate training included pain tolerance," Kalen continued, unimpressed by the silence. "They are thorough in their dehumanization." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, the raw power of his presence seeming to suck the very air from the space. He knelt in front of the asset, bringing them face to face. The proximity was overwhelming. The alpha scent he had detected before was now a tidal wave, crashing against the crumbling walls of his chemical suppression. It smelled of granite after a storm, of scorched earth, of something ancient and predatory. It triggered a primal, biological response deep in his cells, a terror so profound it felt like a memory from a species he no longer belonged to. He flinched back. Kalen's hand shot out again, cupping the back of his neck, his thumb pressing into the sensitive junction of nerve and muscle below his skull. The grip was not cruel, but it was absolute. It held him in place, forcing him to meet that frozen gaze. "They have done a remarkable job," Kalen murmured, his eyes scanning the asset's face with a clinician's detachment. "Scrubbed you clean, not a trace of who you were, not even a scent, just a blank slate, a weapon in a skin." His other hand came up, fingers gently probing the side of the asset's face, tracing the line of his broken jaw. The touch was unexpectedly careful. "But the body remembers," Kalen said softly. "The body always knows what it is, even when the mind has been taught to forget." Before Asset 734 could process the words, Kalen's thumb hooked inside his cheek while his other hand braced his skull. There was a swift, brutal twist. The world exploded into white light and searing agony. A choked gasp, the first sound he had made, was torn from his throat as his jaw snapped back into its socket. The pain receded almost as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a dull, echoing ache and the salty taste of blood. Tears, an involuntary physiological response, pricked at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away furiously. Weakness was a flaw to be eradicated. Kalen released him and stood up, wiping a smear of the asset's blood from his thumb onto his uniform. "There," he said. "Functional again." He returned to the door, his back to the asset. "You are wondering why you are not dead." It was not a question. Asset 734 remained silent, his mind racing, trying to rebuild the logical framework that had been shattered. This was a psychological interrogation. The Warlord was attempting to create a dependency to break him through disorientation rather than crude torture. The objective was information. He would give him none. "I told my men I do not take prisoners," Kalen said, his voice resonating in the stone chamber. "It is a practical rule, not a moral one. The Directorate is an infection. They turn prisoners. They implant compulsions, sleeper commands, psychic triggers. A captured soldier returned to us is a bomb waiting to detonate. It is cleaner to grant them a quick death. It is a mercy to my own people." He turned, and his eyes were chips of ice in the fiery light. "But you," he said, his gaze sweeping over the asset's form, "are not a soldier. You are not a person. You are a piece of Directorate equipment, and I do not destroy a novel piece of technology until I understand how it works." The words were cold, pragmatic. They were also a perfect echo of the language of his own conditioning. Asset, equipment, technology. He was being recategorized, moved from one inventory to another, from a Directorate asset to a warlord's curiosity. The thought was strangely, horrifyingly familiar. It was a cage he understood. "You are an Omega," Kalen stated, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. Asset 734's blood ran cold. The term was archaic, clinical. It was a biological classification, a vulnerability that had been systematically erased from his being. He was a null, a neutered, scentless, functional unit. He was not that. "Do not bother to deny it," Kalen continued, a flicker of something like contempt in his eyes. "I can feel it, a void where a presence should be, an emptiness that screams its artificiality. They scooped you out, didn't they? Took everything that made you what you are and replaced it with this." He gestured vaguely at the asset, a motion of dismissal. "Obedience, nullifiers, chemical restraints. You are a ghost because they murdered the person you were born to be." The first signs of withdrawal were beginning, a faint tremor in his hands, a cold sweat beading on his brow, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. The nullifiers and suppressants were on a 24-hour cycle, administered through an auto-injector in his suit. The cycle had been broken. His body, so long held in chemical stasis, was beginning to stir. "The Directorate fears biology," Kalen said, pacing slowly before the door. "They fear instinct. They believe they can perfect humanity by cutting it away, piece by piece, until nothing is left but logic and steel. They are fools. They create things like you, broken instruments that will inevitably turn on their masters." He stopped and looked at Asset 734, a long, piercing stare. "You will remain here. You will be given food and water. You will not be harmed." A dark, humorless smile touched his lips. "At least, not by me. Your own body, however, is about to go to war with your conditioning. I'm interested to see which one wins." He turned and exited the chamber. The heavy stone door swung shut with a deep, final boom that echoed in the asset's bones. A series of metallic clicks followed as a heavy magnetic lock engaged. He was alone, alone with the throbbing in his jaw, the tremor in his hands, and the warlord's words echoing in the oppressive silence. "The body always knows what it is." A wave of nausea rolled through him. He pressed his forehead against the cool, rough-hewn stone of the wall, his breath coming in shallow, controlled pants. This was a test, an elaborate form of torture. He would not break. He was not an Omega. He was not a person. He was Asset 734. He was Asset 734. The tremor in his hands grew stronger. Kalen stood before the chromaglass window in his private study, a chamber adjacent to the one where the asset was now confined. The same river of lava flowed below, painting the room in shifting shades of crimson and gold. On his desk, a data slate showed the asset's schematics, pulled from the fortress's deep scan of him during his capture. It was a marvel of directorate engineering, a circulatory system laced with nanites for cellular repair, a skeletal structure reinforced with crystalline carbon, a neural interface woven directly into the brainstem, and a bioregulator unit, a small dark node near the spine designed to dispense a cocktail of hormones, suppressants, and nullifiers. It was this last piece of technology that held Kalen's attention. He zoomed in on the image, his expression grim. It was a chemical leash, a cage built from the inside out. He had fought the Directorate for 2 decades. He had seen their weapons, their genetically engineered soldiers, their cold and brutal tactics. But this felt different. It was a deeper, more insidious violation. They had not merely trained a soldier, they had unmade a person. He thought back to the moment in the command nexus. He had been tracking the subtle psychic ripples of the intruder for minutes before the asset made his move. It was a faint, cold whisper in the back of his mind, a psychic signature so heavily shielded, it was almost undetectable. But Kalen's own abilities were raw, untutored, and primal. He did not read thoughts, he felt presences, and the asset's presence was a vacuum, a hole in the psychic fabric of the room. That was what had drawn his eye. Not a sound, not a movement, but a profound and unnatural emptiness. An alpha's instinct, honed by a lifetime of war, had screamed at him. Wrongness. When he held the asset in his arms, the wrongness was a physical sensation. The body was light, too light, the frame delicate beneath the advanced suit. There was no scent, not even the clean smell of soap or the faint odor of sweat that clung to every living thing. There was only the sterile tang of the chemicals that saturated his system, and beneath it all, a deep, cellular resonance that his own biology recognized and recoiled from. An Omega, chained and sleeping. He remembered a time, years ago, in the early days of the war. A Directorate captain he had captured. The man had been cooperative, eager to share intelligence. He had renounced the Directorate, spoken of their tyranny. Kalen, younger and more trusting then, had seen a potential ally. 2 weeks later, the man had walked into the fortress's primary reactor core and overloaded the system, a sleeper command triggered by a coded phrase in a routine communication. The explosion had cost Kalen 300 of his people and nearly his own life. It was a lesson he had carved into his soul. He did not take prisoners. He did not trust the words of those who had lived under the Directorate's shadow. He did not allow their poison to seep into his walls. Yet the ghost now slept in the room next to his own heart. This was not the same. The captain had been a man broken and remade into a weapon. The asset was something else. He felt less like a repurposed tool and more like a desecrated shrine. The Directorate had not broken him. They had prevented him from ever being whole. There was a fundamental difference. One was an act of war, the other an act of sacrilege. His captain, Warlord, entered the study, his heavy footsteps hesitant. Warlord was a man of simple conviction. He followed Kalen with unwavering loyalty, but he was not a man who understood nuance. "General," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the nexus is secure. The men are unsettled. They are soldiers. Uncertainty is part of their work," Kalen replied, without turning from the window. "They wonder why the Directorate phantom still draws breath," Warlord pressed, unable to hide the concern in his tone. Your order has always been absolute. The order is to protect this fortress and our people from Directorate infiltration, Kalen corrected him, his voice sharp. The execution of prisoners is the most efficient means to that end. It is not a sacrament. He turned to face his captain. That thing in the next room is not a prisoner in the way you understand it. It is a message. It is a walking testament to the perversion we are fighting against. To kill it would be to erase the evidence, to grant the Directorate the mercy of a clean slate. Vorlag frowned, struggling with the concept. So, you mean to study it, like a captured drone? I mean to see what the Directorate has created, and what they have destroyed, Kalen said. And I mean to see what happens when their creation is unchained. Unchained? Vorlag's eyes widened in alarm. General, that is unwise. We don't know what it is capable of. Its psychic signature was hidden, deceptive. It could be a trap. It is a trap, Kalen agreed. But not for us. It is a cage for the being trapped inside it. The Directorate's mistake was in believing they could build a cage strong enough to hold nature itself. They have suppressed its biology, but they have not eliminated it. All it needs is time. A low chime sounded from the console on his desk. Kalen glanced at it. A small, blinking light indicated that the audio-visual sensors in the asset's room were active. Another light glowed beside it, this one tied to atmospheric and biochemical sensors. Its vital signs are fluctuating, Kalen murmured, his eyes on the data stream. Heart rate is elevating. Body temperature is rising. The first stages of systemic shock from the withdrawal of the regulatory nanites. Vorlag looked uneasy. What will happen to it? Kalen's gaze returned to the molten river below. The light cast his face in harsh shadows, making him look like one of the stone effigies that lined the fortress halls. The nullifiers will be purged from its system first. Its senses will return. Then the hormonal suppressants will begin to fail. Its body will try to restart processes that have been dormant for years, perhaps its entire life. It will be violent. He fell silent, a strange, grim look on his face. He was not merely a warlord observing an enemy. He was a biologist watching a chrysalis being forcibly torn open. The process would be agonizing. It might not even be survivable, but it would be true. For the first time in the asset's life, his body would be speaking its own language, and Kalen, the enemy, the butcher, the man who did not take prisoners, would be the only one there to listen. Leave me, he commanded Vorlag. Maintain the perimeter. No one enters or leaves my wing without my direct authorization. Vorlag hesitated, then gave a curt nod and departed, his heavy presence replaced by the humming silence of the fortress. Kalen remained at the window, his gaze distant. He felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring in his gut. It was not pity. He did not deal in pity. It was a cold, hard anger, directed not at the ghost in his chambers, but at its creators. And beneath the anger, something else. A grim proprietary curiosity. He had claimed the asset not as a prisoner, but as a specimen, a broken thing he intended to understand by watching it either heal or shatter. It was a cold, clinical objective. Or so he told himself. The silence was the first thing to break. It had been a constant companion, a feature of his nullified state, the world muted, as if heard through thick layers of cotton. Now, it was fraying at the edges. Asset 734 lay on the coarse mattress, his body rigid, and listened to the sounds he had been trained to ignore. He could hear the low, resonant hum of the fortress, not as a single note, but as a symphony of distinct vibrations. The slow, deep thrum of the geothermal converters, the whisper of air through a hidden vent, the faint, rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep in the stone, and beneath it all, a sound so low it was felt more than heard, the grinding of the mountain itself, a slow, geological sigh. The sounds grew sharper, more defined, each one a tiny needle against his raw nerves. His conditioning screamed at him to filter it, to push it back into the grey, uniform silence. But the filters were failing. His mind, for so long a clean, orderly space, was being invaded by sensory data it could no longer process. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the stone slab. A wave of dizziness washed over him. The tremor in his hands was now a constant, visible shudder. He clenched his fist, trying to still them, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. His body was no longer obeying his commands. It was beginning to assert its own ancient, long-silenced authority. He looked at the tall, armored window. The light from the lava river seemed brighter now, the orange deeper, the shadows it cast darker and more menacing. It hurt his eyes. He squeezed them shut, but the image was seared onto the inside of his lids, a pulsing, painful glare. He was Asset 734, an instrument of the Directorate. His purpose was termination. His state was optimal efficiency. These were the foundational truths of his existence, but the truths were becoming unstable, the words losing their meaning. He felt a cold knot of something unfamiliar twisting in his gut. His trainers had a word for it, a clinical term for an undesirable chemical reaction: fear. He stood and walked on unsteady legs to the metal desk. A pitcher of water and a single nutrient-dense ration bar sat on its surface. Provisions. The Warlord was keeping his specimen alive. He ignored the food. His stomach was a roiling pit of nausea. He poured a cup of water, his hands shaking so badly that some of it sloshed over the rim. The water was cold against his lips. He drank greedily, the simple physical sensation a momentary anchor in the rising storm. And then came the scent. It started faintly, a whisper on the edge of his perception. The sterile metallic smell of the recycled air was tinged with something else, the mineral-sharp scent of the stone walls, the faint, clean smell of the water. He took another breath, deeper this time, and a new scent hit him, one that made him recoil. It was coming from the furs on the bed. It was musky, warm, and overwhelmingly primal. It was the scent of an animal. It was the scent of the Warlord, Kalen's scent. It clung to the furs, a territorial marking that saturated the entire room. He backed away from the bed, a fresh wave of revulsion and panic rising in him. The scent was an invasion, a violation. It bypassed his rational mind and spoke directly to a part of him he did not know existed, a part that was terrified and impossibly intrigued. He stumbled back until his shoulders hit the cold stone wall, and he slid down to the floor. He brought his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, trying to make himself smaller, to shrink away from the sensory assault. He was losing control. The clean, cold fortress of his mind was being overrun. The walls were crumbling, and in their place, something wild and unknown was beginning to grow. He pressed his face into his knees, trying to block out the light, the sound, the scent. But it was no use. A new smell was entering the cacophony, one that was subtler, closer. It was coming from him. He lifted his head, his breath catching in his throat. He tentatively sniffed the air around his own body. The chemical nullity was gone. In its place was a faint, clean fragrance he didn't recognize. It smelled like the air after a lightning strike, of ozone and petrichor, the scent of rain on dry earth. It was his scent, his own. The realization was not a relief. It was a horror. This scent was the original sin of his biology, the flaw he had been created to overcome. It was the mark of the Omega. He scrambled away from himself, pressing his back harder against the wall as if he could escape his own skin. He was contaminated. He was compromised. He was becoming. The ration bar on the desk suddenly seemed intensely appealing. A sharp, desperate hunger pang, more powerful than any he had ever experienced, shot through him. The Directorate's nutrient paste was efficient, tasteless fuel. The idea of the solid, textured bar was almost overwhelming. He needed it. The need was a physical ache, a gnawing emptiness that demanded to be filled. He crawled to the desk, his body acting on an impulse his mind could not contain. He grabbed the bar, his trembling fingers struggling with the wrapper. He tore it open and bit into it. The taste exploded in his mouth. Sweet, savory, nutty. It was a supernova of flavor. He had never tasted anything like it. He devoured it in 3 bites, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. It wasn't enough. The hunger was still there, a roaring fire in his belly. He drank the rest of the water, but it did nothing to quell the craving. His body was demanding fuel, demanding sustenance for the violent transformation it was undergoing. He was a machine being starved of energy at the very moment its engine was roaring to life. A wave of heat washed over him, starting in his belly and spreading outward to his limbs. His skin felt flushed, sensitive. The rough texture of his biosuit was suddenly an unbearable abrasion against his flesh. He needed it off. He tore at the seals at his neck and wrists, his movements clumsy and frantic. The suit hissed as the pressure equalized, and he peeled it away, his own unfamiliar scent blooming into the air, stronger now. He was left in a thin, grey underlayer. His skin, pale and covered in a fine sheen of sweat, felt electric. Every nerve ending was on fire. The air moving over his arms was a physical touch, the contact of the undersuit a heavy, suffocating weight. He looked down at his hands. They were still trembling, but the tremor was different now. It was not a sign of weakness, but of a deep, thrumming power awakening in his veins. The world was resolving into painful, terrifying clarity. The muted grey of his existence was being flooded with color, with sound, with sensation. He was not an asset. He was not a null. The Warlord was right. The body remembers, and his was beginning to scream. He curled into a ball on the cold stone floor, shivering despite the heat that consumed him, and waited for the next wave to hit. Kalen watched the data stream on his monitor, his face an impassive mask. Heart rate, 130 BPM. Body temperature, 39.4 degrees AUX. Biochemical sensors detected a sharp spike in adrenaline and a cascade of previously dormant hormones flooding the asset's system. The bioregulator near his spine, deprived of its external command signals, was beginning to fail catastrophically, dumping its remaining chemical payload in a last, desperate attempt to maintain control. It was poisoning him. On the visual feed, a silent, black and white image from the corner of the room, he saw the asset, the Omega, writhe on the floor. He had stripped off the outer layer of his suit. His body was lean, almost gaunt, a map of pale skin and sharp angles. He was shivering violently, his muscles locked in seizure. Kalen's hand tightened into a fist. This was the clinical observation he had wanted. This was the unchaining. He should feel a grim satisfaction. He should feel vindicated in his assessment of the Directorate's methods. Instead, he felt a hot, visceral anger. He was watching a man being tortured by his own biology, a body fighting a civil war against the chemical shackles that had bound it for a lifetime. The Directorate had not just built a cage, they had built a self-destruct mechanism. They would rather their asset die from the shock of withdrawal than be captured and interrogated. It was brutally efficient, and it was utterly depraved. The Omega on the floor arched his back, or a silent scream locked in his throat. His fever was climbing to a dangerous level. The nanites in his blood, designed for repair, were likely attacking his own awakening cells as foreign invaders. He could die. The thought landed with unexpected weight. The death of a Directorate operative should be a matter of indifference, even satisfaction. But watching this slow, agonizing dissolution felt wasteful. It was the destruction of something unique. He had seen thousands die in battle. He had given the order for executions. Death was a part of his world, as familiar as the stone of his fortress. But this was not a clean death on a battlefield. This was a body tearing itself apart from the inside, a frantic, desperate struggle for life that was doomed to fail. He could let it happen. It was the logical, safe choice. An enemy would be eliminated without him having to lift a finger. The potential threat of a psychic Omega in his fortress would be neutralized. Warlord would be relieved. His own long-held rule would, in a way, be upheld. The prisoner would not survive, but Kaelin had not risen to rule the clans by always making the safe choice. He had risen by instinct, by recognizing the pivotal moment when a calculated risk could change the tide of a war. And his instinct now was screaming at him, a primal, gut-level certainty that letting this being die was a profound mistake. He did not know why. It was not logic. It was not compassion. It was a warlord's intuition, the same intuition that told him where to reinforce a defensive line or when to press an attack. The Omega was valuable, alive. He turned from the monitor and strode out of his study, the heavy door booming shut behind him. He crossed the short corridor to the confinement chamber. He keyed in the release code. The magnetic locks disengaged with a series of loud clicks. He pushed the heavy stone door open and stepped inside. The room was hot, humid, and filled with a scent that was both jarring and intoxicating. The sterile chemical smell was gone, replaced by the sharp scent of ozone and rain, now underscored by the acrid tang of fever and pain. It was the scent of a body in crisis, a scent of life fighting desperately against death. The Omega was on the floor, his eyes squeezed shut, his face pale and slick with sweat. His breath was coming in shallow, ragged pants. He was no longer seizing, but lay limp, his body twitching with fine tremors. Kaelin knelt beside him. He placed a bare hand on the Omega's forehead. The heat was shocking, a dry, burning fire. He was burning alive. "Asset," Kaelin said, his voice low but firm. There was no response. The Omega's consciousness had retreated, leaving only the body to fight its unwinnable war. Kaelin knew something of field medicine, of the brutal triage of the battlefield. But this was not a wound from a pulse rifle or a vibro blade. This was a systemic failure, a cellular rebellion. He could not order it to stop. He could not stitch it closed. He could, however, intervene. The bioregulator was the source of the poison. It had to be disabled. The schematics he had studied showed an external access port for emergency flushing, located just over the fourth lumbar vertebra. It would be painful. It would be invasive. It was the only chance. He gathered the Omega into his arms. The body was light, frighteningly so, all sinew and bone. He carried him to the stone bed and laid him on his stomach. The Omega murmured something, a faint, delirious whisper. Kalen leaned closer to hear it. Parameter. Not found. Even unconscious, his mind was still trapped in the cage of its conditioning, searching for a command that did not exist. Kalen felt that cold anger return, sharper this time. He pulled up the thin grey undersuit, exposing the Omega's back. The skin was slick with sweat, the spine a delicate, articulated ridge. He located the access port, a small circular indentation in the skin, almost invisible. It required a specific code, transmitted via a low-frequency psychic pulse, to open. A fail-safe. Kalen closed his eyes, focusing his will. He was not a subtle psychic. His power was a hammer, not a scalpel. He couldn't read minds, but he could break down doors. He formed the command sequence from the schematics in his mind and pushed it, a concentrated burst of psychic energy, at the port. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, a tiny panel slid open, revealing a recessed socket. The next step was the flush. It required a massive surge of bioelectric energy to overload the regulator and force it to purge its contents. Kalen placed the palm of his hand over the port. He took a deep breath, drawing on his own body's energy. This was another raw, untutored application of his abilities, a trick he'd learned to restart the hearts of fallen soldiers or jumpstart failing machinery. It was draining. It was dangerous. He pushed. The Omega's body arched off the bed with a violent, convulsive jerk. A raw, agonized scream was torn from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. It was the sound of every nerve ending being set on fire. It was the sound of the cage being broken with brute force, the scream cut off into a choked gasp. The body went limp, collapsing back onto the mattress. A thin trickle of dark, viscous fluid, the chemical cocktail from the regulator, oozed from the port and onto Kalen's hand. It was warm and smelled faintly of almonds and ozone. It was the smell of the Directorate's control, now rendered inert. The Omega was unconscious, his breathing dangerously shallow. His fever had not broken. The poison was purged, but the damage was done. Now it was a simple, brutal matter of survival. Kalen stood, looking down at the still form. He had intervened. He had crossed a line, moving from observer to participant. He had saved the life of his enemy, his specimen. He did not fully understand why. He only knew that the thought of this unique, brutalized creature dying alone on his floor was an outcome he could not accept. He left the room and returned moments later with a basin of cool water and clean cloths. He sat on the edge of the stone slab, a silent, grim-faced nursemaid to a ghost. He began to bathe the Omega's face and neck, the cool water hissing against the burning skin. The delirious murmurs started again, fragments of a life spent in a sterile hell. Efficiency rating: 98%. Acceptable loss, reprimand, scheduled. Each whispered phrase was a fresh indictment of his creators. Kalen worked in silence, his movements methodical. He cleaned the purged fluid from the Omega's back. He cooled his fevered skin. He listened to the broken pieces of his conditioning. He was no longer just a warlord. He was a witness. The fever broke like a storm. One moment, he was drowning in fire, his mind a chaotic landscape of fractured memories and sensory noise. The next, he was adrift on a cool, quiet sea. Consciousness returned slowly, a dim light dawning at the edge of a long darkness. The first thing he registered was the absence of pain. The roaring agony in his cells had subsided to a dull, distant ache. The second was the weight. A heavy, damp cloth was draped across his forehead, and a thick fur pelt was drawn up to his chin. The weight was comforting, grounding. He opened his eyes. The room was cast in the same dim, orange glow from the lava river, but the light no longer felt harsh. It was soft, gentle. He was lying on the stone bed, tucked under the furs Kalen had scented. The smell was still there, but it no longer inspired panic. It was simply present, a fact of his new environment. He turned his head. General Kalen was sitting in a chair he had pulled up beside the bed. He wasn't sleeping. His eyes were open, fixed on the far wall, his expression lost in thought. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually severe face was softened by exhaustion. He had been there for some time. The memory of what had happened returned in disjointed, nightmarish flashes. The sensory overload, the pain, the fever, the feeling of his body being torn apart. And then, a memory of a cool hand on his forehead. A low, calm voice cutting through the delirium, though he could not recall the words. A sharp, blinding agony in his back, followed by a sense of release, as if a poison had been drawn from a wound. He slowly, carefully, sat up. The fur pelt slid down to his waist. He was still in the thin grey undersuit, but it was damp with sweat. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but his mind was clear. It was a clarity unlike anything he had ever known. The clean, cold logic of his conditioning was gone, shattered. In its place was a vast, terrifying silence. It was the silence of a blank page. Kalen turned his head, his gaze meeting the assets. His eyes were as cold and clear as ever, but the analytical detachment was gone, replaced by something else, a weary watchfulness. "You are awake," Kalen stated. It was not a question. Asset 734. No, not Asset 734. That designation felt like a suit of armor that no longer fit. He didn't have another name to replace it. He said nothing. He didn't know what to say. His vocal cords felt unused, alien. "The regulator has been flushed," Kalen informed him, his voice a low rumble. "The last of the Directorate's poison is out of your system. What happens now is up to your own biology." He gestured to the desk. The pitcher of water had been refilled, and there were more ration bars. "You will need to eat. Your metabolism will be accelerated." He was right. A deep, gnawing hunger was already making itself known, a hollow ache in the pit of his stomach. He looked at his hands. They were steady. The tremors were gone. He felt weak, drained, but the frantic, chaotic energy had subsided. He felt empty. He pushed the furs aside and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He stood on shaky legs, using the wall for support, and made his way to the desk. He ate 2 of the ration bars with a slow, deliberate intensity, savoring the taste, the texture. He drank the water. He was fueling a body he no longer recognized. When he was done, he turned to face the Warlord. He had to know. "Why?" The word came out as a rough, hoarse whisper. It was a first question he had ever asked. Kalen regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said finally. "I wanted to see what would happen when your cage was broken. Letting you die of a seizure was an inconclusive result." The answer was as cold and clinical as before, but it felt insufficient. It didn't explain the chair by the bed, or the cool cloth, or the exhaustion etched on the warlord's face. It didn't explain the fact that he was alive. "You saved me," he whispered, the words feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. "I preserved a potential source of intelligence," Kalen countered, his voice hard. "Do not mistake a tactical decision for sentiment." But his eyes betrayed him. There was a flicker of something in their frozen depths, a momentary thaw that he quickly suppressed. He stood and walked to the other side of the room, where a section of the stone wall was polished to a near-perfect mirror finish. It was a strange vanity in such a Spartan chamber. "Your creators gave you a designation," Kalen said, his back to him. "They did not give you a name. A name is the first thing a person is given. It is the first thing they took from you." He paused. "What will you call yourself?" The question was a quiet challenge. He had no answer. He had never been a person. He was a function, a tool. Asset 734. He walked to the mirrored wall, his reflection emerging from the dark stone as he approached. He saw a stranger, a young man with wide, haunted eyes the color of slate. His face was thin, all sharp cheekbones, and a stubborn jaw. His hair, kept shaved to regulation length, was beginning to grow out, a soft, dark fuzz. But it was the expression that held him. It was an expression of profound, bewildered emptiness. He was a ghost looking at his own reflection for the first time. He was nothing. He was no one. The silence stretched, filled only by the low hum of the fortress. "Elian," a voice said. He looked up, startled, but Kalen hadn't spoken. The name had come from inside his own head, a whisper from the deep, quiet sea of his newfound consciousness. It felt right, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a lifetime. "Elian," he repeated, his own voice giving it sound, giving it life. He looked at his reflection and spoke the name again, firmer this time. "My name is Elian." For the first time, he met Kalen's gaze in the reflection. The warlord was watching him, his arms crossed over his chest. A flicker of something that might have been approval crossed his features before it was gone. "Elian," Kalen repeated, testing the sound of the name in the air. "A beginning." Elian turned from the mirror, his legs feeling stronger, more certain. The emptiness inside him was still there, but it was no longer a terrifying void. It was a space waiting to be filled. He was a blank page, and he had just written the first word. "What do you want from me?" Elian asked, his voice clearer now. "Intelligence," Kalen answered immediately. "Everything you know about the Directorate's psychic warfare program, their assets, their training methods, their command structure. And when I have told you everything," Kalen's gaze was direct, unwavering, "then you will have a choice. I can give you safe passage to the neutral territories. You can disappear, start a new life, or you can stay. My fight with the Directorate is far from over. A psychic of your potential, untethered from their control, could be a powerful ally." It was an offer Elian's conditioning could not compute. Choice, agency. These were not variables in his programming. He had been given orders his entire life. He did not know how to choose. "You would trust me?" Elian asked, incredulous. "After I tried to kill you?" "I would not trust you," Kalen corrected him bluntly. "Trust is earned. But I would use you, just as the Directorate did. The difference is, I am giving you the choice to be used." The brutal honesty was more compelling than any lie could have been. The Directorate had cloaked his servitude in the language of purpose and efficiency. Kalen offered him servitude and called it by its name, but left the door to the cage open. "I need time," Elian said. "The world is loud." Kalen gave a single, sharp nod. "You have it. Rest, recover. Your body has a long way to go to heal from what was done to it." He turned to leave. "Kalen," Elian called out, stopping him at the door. The warlord turned back, one eyebrow raised. Elian searched for the right words, but his vocabulary for this new world was so limited. He settled for the simplest truth. "Thank you." Kalen did not reply. He simply held Elian's gaze for a long, silent moment before turning and leaving the room, the heavy door booming shut behind him, leaving Elian alone with his new name, his new hunger, and the terrifying, exhilarating weight of his first choice. The days that followed blurred into a strange, rhythmic cycle of recovery and revelation. Kalen kept his word. Elian was left alone, provided with food, water, and the quiet solitude of his stone chamber. He spent the time reacquainting himself with the body he had inhabited, but never truly known. The process of healing was not just physical, it was a sensory and emotional awakening that was both wondrous and excruciating. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. His revitalized metabolism burned through the ration bars, and soon trays of hot food began to appear outside his door. Stews of root vegetables and tough meat, coarse black bread, sharp, pungent cheeses. The first time he tasted the stew, the rich, savory flavor was so overwhelming, he almost wept. It was the taste of life, real and unsterilized. His senses, no longer suppressed, continued to sharpen. He could distinguish the individual scents of the food on his tray, the smell of the rain-scented ozone of his own body, and the ever-present, musky scent of Kalen that seemed to have permeated the very stone of the chamber. He learned to listen to the sounds of the fortress, to distinguish the shift changes of the guards in the corridor from the rhythmic clang of the forges deep below. The world was no longer a muted, grey landscape. It was a vibrant and often overwhelming tapestry of sensation. But the most profound change was happening within the silent spaces of his own mind. Without the rigid framework of his conditioning, his thoughts were fluid, chaotic. Memories began to surface, not the clean, data-driven recollections of his training, but hazy, emotional fragments of a life before. A flash of a woman's face, a smile sad, the feel of soft grass under his bare feet, the sound of singing. He didn't know if they were real memories or the phantoms of a mind trying to build itself a history. They were fleeting, painful, and precious. With this new internal landscape came the return of his psychic abilities, but they were different now. Before, his psychic sense was a tool, a probe he could extend to read data or shield his presence. It was cold, precise, and controlled. Now, it was a part of him, an extension of his own senses. It was empathic. He could feel the low, simmering anger and fierce loyalty of the guards who brought his food. He could feel the deep, groaning exhaustion of the mountain itself. And sometimes, late at night, when the fortress was quiet, he could feel Kalen. It wasn't a conscious projection. It was a low, steady hum on the edge of his perception, a psychic presence of immense, controlled power. He could feel the weight of Kalen's command, the profound loneliness of his position, and a deep, abiding rage that was the engine of his war against the Directorate. It was an intimacy Elian had never experienced, and it terrified him. He was a prisoner, an enemy, yet he could feel the heart of the man who held him captive. One evening, the door to his chamber opened. Kalen stood there, his imposing frame filling the doorway. He held a small, flat box. "It is time," the Warlord said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He entered and placed the box on the desk. "Your abilities are returning, unfocused, uncontrolled. Before you give me the intelligence I require, I need to know the extent of your capabilities, and I need to know if you can control them." Elian looked at the box. "What is it?" "A test," Kalen said simply. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a single, perfect crystal, cut into a complex geometric shape. It was cool to the touch and seemed to drink the light from the room. "This is a psionic amplifier," Kalen explained. "The shamans of the outer clans use them to focus their visions. It will resonate with your psychic energy. I want you to hold it and focus on one thing: the Directorate's primary command center on Meridian. Show me what you see." Elian stared at the crystal. His training had involved focus exercises, but they were sterile simulations, interfacing with machines. This was organic. It was primitive. He hesitated. "I don't know if I can. You tried to assassinate me from 60 feet away, through a polarized chromaglass shield, with a weapon that required a psychic targeting lock. You can do this," Kalen stated flatly. There was no encouragement in his tone, only a statement of fact. Elian picked up the crystal. It felt cold and inert in his hand. He sat on the edge of the bed, closed his eyes, and did as he was told. He focused his mind, not with the cold precision of his training, but by sinking into the quiet sea of his own consciousness. He thought of Meridian, the sterile white towers, the cold blue light of its artificial sun. He let the image fill his mind. The crystal in his hand began to grow warm. A low hum vibrated through his palm, traveling up his arm. The hum grew into a clear, resonant tone inside his head. And then, he was no longer in the stone chamber. He was falling through a void of white light and data streams. He saw the Meridian Command Center, not as a physical place, but as a nexus of psychic energy. He saw the thoughts of the controllers, cold, logical streams of tactical data. He saw the fear of the lower-level functionaries, a constant low-level anxiety about efficiency ratings and reprimands. He saw the cold, empty heart of the machine. He pushed deeper, searching for the Psychic Warfare Division. He found it shielded, a black hole in the network of minds. But the shield was not perfect. He could feel the minds within it, minds like his own had been, cold, empty, controlled. One of them felt familiar, a cold spark of a presence he recognized from his own training facility. Asset 739, his replacement, a new ghost, being calibrated for a new mission. The vision was so clear, so intense. He felt a surge of something. Not pity, not anger. A strange, aching sense of recognition. He saw himself in that cold, empty mind. The crystal in his hand grew hotter, the hum rising in pitch. He felt a presence touch his own, a query from the Directorate's psychic network. They had sensed his probe. Alarms were going off in that distant, sterile room. He tried to pull back, but the connection held him. He was exposed. And then, another presence joined his, wrapping around his own like a shield of iron. It was vast, powerful, and utterly unyielding. It was Kalen. He wasn't just observing. He was connected to Elian, using Elian's focus as a conduit. Kalen's raw, primal power flooded the connection, shattering the Directorate's probe. The feedback was a psychic scream that threw Elian back onto the bed, the crystal falling from his hand and clattering to the floor. He gasped, his heart hammering in his chest, the stone chamber slowly resolving back into focus around him. Kalen stood over him, his face grim, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose. "Impressive," the warlord said, wiping the blood away with the back of his hand. "Your reach is considerable, and your control is non-existent. You almost got us both captured or killed." Elian was still breathing heavily, the phantom sensation of the Directorate's mines clinging to him like a shroud. "I saw my replacement. I saw him too," Kalen said, his voice dark. "They are sending another one." He looked down at Elian, his eyes boring into him. "Which brings us back to your choice. The Directorate does not leave loose ends. They will come for you. They will come here. You can run to the neutral territories and they will hunt you, or you can stay here and we can fight them together." The choice was no longer an abstract concept. It was a stark, immediate reality. Run and be hunted for the rest of his life, or stand and fight the creators who had stolen his past and would surely try to steal his future. He looked at Kalen, at the blood on his hand, at the fierce, unyielding certainty in his eyes. In that moment, Kalen was not his captor. He was his only shield against the storm that was coming. The decision was surprisingly simple. "I will stay," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. "I will fight." Kalen watched him for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. "Good," he said. "Then your training begins tomorrow." The promise held no warmth, only the cold, hard finality of a battle line being drawn in the sand. Elian was no longer a prisoner. He was a soldier in a new war, a war for his own soul. The promise of training was fulfilled with a brutal and relentless efficiency that Elian recognized from his former life, but where the Directorate's methods were sterile, psychological, and designed to strip away his humanity. Kalen's were raw, physical, and aimed at forging it into a weapon. They began at dawn each day in a cavernous training hall deep within the fortress. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, hot metal, and ozone. Kalen was an unforgiving instructor. He pushed Elian's recovering body to its absolute limits, forcing him through grueling exercises that rebuilt his atrophied muscles and honed his reflexes. He taught him to fight not with the cold, calculated precision of a Directorate asset, but with the instinct and fury of a cornered animal. Every sparring session ended with Elian bruised, breathless, and sprawled on the cold stone floor. Kalen would stand over him not with contempt, but with a critical, appraising eye. "You think too much," the warlord would say, his voice a low growl. "You anticipate. You calculate. An asset analyzes a threat. A warrior feels it. Stop thinking. Start feeling." It was a complete inversion of everything Elian had been taught. To feel was to be vulnerable, to be inefficient. But under Kalen's relentless tutelage, he began to understand. He learned to feel the shift in his opponent's weight, to sense the subtle tells of their intent, to let his body react without the delay of conscious thought. He was unlearning a lifetime of conditioning, one painful lesson at a time. The physical training was paired with psychic conditioning that was even more demanding. Kalen would take him to the highest spires of the fortress, where the wind howled with the fury of a banshee, and make him extend his senses. "The Directorate taught you to shield," Kalen shouted over the wind. "Shielding is a cage. I will teach you to filter. Let the world in, but do not let it overwhelm you. Find the signal in the noise." Elian would sit for hours, battered by the wind and the cacophony of the fortress below, and learn to separate the thousands of psychic whispers that filled the air. He learned to identify individual soldiers by their unique mental signature, to feel the emotional state of the forge-smiths in the depths, to sense the slow, deep thoughts of the mountain itself. It was exhausting, maddening work. More than once, he was overwhelmed, collapsing under the sensory assault, his mind a screaming chaos. Each time, Kaelin would be there, a grounding presence of immense, unshakable calm. He would place a hand on Elian's shoulder, and his quiet, controlled strength would flow into him, a silent shield that allowed Elian to find his center again. In these moments, a strange and unspoken bond was being forged between them. It was not friendship. It was not the bond of master and student. It was the stark, primal connection of two solitary predators who had recognized a shared strength in each other. During their sessions, Kaelin was a harsh, demanding teacher. But in the quiet moments between, Elian began to see the man beneath the Warlord. He saw the way Kaelin's eyes would linger on the lava river, his expression unreadable, but tinged with a deep, profound melancholy. He noticed the way Kaelin moved with a quiet, contained grief, the weight of his command a tangible presence. One evening, after a particularly brutal session, they sat in silence in Kaelin's study, sharing a simple meal. Elian, nursing a bruised rib, finally asked the question that had been haunting him. "Why do you hate them so much?" Kaelin was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the flames of a nearby brazier. "My sister was taken by them," he said finally, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "When we were children, our settlement was on the borderlands. They called it a re-education and integration program. They took the gifted ones, the ones with potential." He picked up a small, carved stone from his desk, turning it over and over in his fingers. "She was like you, an Omega. She was bright, full of life. They told my parents she would be given opportunities, a better life. We received messages from her for the first year. They were sterile, wrong. Her words, but not her voice. Then nothing." He paused, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone. 10 years later, during the siege of Xylos, a Directorate infiltrator breached my command post. It moved with impossible speed and precision. It killed 12 of my best guards before I could stop it. His eyes, when he finally looked at Elian, were haunted. It was her, or what was left of her. They had done to her what they did to you. Scooped her out, turned her into a weapon. She didn't even recognize me. He fell silent, the story hanging in the air between them, heavier than any physical blow. "She had a fail-safe," Kaelin continued, his voice barely a whisper. "When I disabled her, a chemical trigger in her brain erased her. A complete cellular breakdown. They wouldn't even leave me a body to bury. They just deleted their mistake." In that moment, Elian understood. Kaelin's war was not for territory or resources. It was a crusade, a deeply personal, all-consuming vendetta against the system that had stolen his sister and twisted her into a monster. He looked at Elian not just as a weapon or a curiosity, but as a ghost of the person his sister might have become. That was why he had saved him. It was not a tactical decision. It was an act of penance, an attempt to save the one he couldn't save before. The revelation shifted something deep inside Elian. His fight was no longer just for his own survival. It was for Kaelin, too. It was for the bright, laughing girl who had been erased. The training intensified. Elian's control grew, his power sharpening to a fine point. He could shield Kaelin's mind during tactical briefings, filtering out psychic static and probing for deception among his own commanders. He could project illusions to confuse enemy patrols, his ghosts more real than the directorates. He and Kalen began to fight as one, a seamless unit of mind and body. In the training halls, their sparring sessions became less about teacher and student and more like a deadly dance. Elian learned to anticipate Kalen's moves, not with his eyes, but with his mind, while Kalen learned to trust Elian's psychic warnings, sidestepping an attack before it was even launched. The unspoken bond between them deepened, evolving into a quiet, profound intimacy. It was a language of shared glances, of synchronized movements, of the silent pressure of Kalen's mind shielding his own. It was more real, more honest than any words could be. And with this intimacy, Elian's own biology, now fully awake and unchained, began to stir in a new way. The overwhelming scent of the alpha was no longer a threat. It was a comfort, a presence that made him feel safe. He found himself watching Kalen, drawn to the quiet strength in his hands, the intensity of his gaze, the rare, fleeting moments when a grim smile would touch his lips. A strange, warm feeling would blossom in his chest, a feeling he had no name for, but one that felt dangerously close to the logical fallacy his trainers had called hope. He was changing, evolving from an asset into a person, and that person was becoming inextricably tied to the Alpha Warlord who had both imprisoned and freed him. He did not know what it meant. He only knew that the coming storm, the arrival of the Directorate's new ghost, was a threat not just to his life, but to the fragile new world he was building in the heart of his enemy's fortress. The attack came not with the roar of an explosion, but with a whisper of silence. It was deep in the fortress's night cycle. Elian was in his chamber, meditating, trying to calm the restless energy that now hummed constantly beneath his skin. He had been feeling it for hours, a subtle, discordant note at the very edge of his psychic perception, a cold spot in the warmth of the mountain. He had warned Kalen, who had placed the fortress on high alert, but the scanners showed nothing. There were no ships, no approaching ground troops. The enemy was already inside. Suddenly, the low, ambient hum of the fortress, the thrum of the converters, the whisper of the vents, the collective mental murmur of 3,000 soldiers vanished. It was not replaced by silence. It was replaced by a profound and absolute nullity, a psychic dead zone that was terrifyingly familiar. It was the feeling of a Directorate null asset. But this was different, stronger. It was as if a black hole had opened in the heart of the mountain, swallowing all sound, all energy, all thought. Elian was on his feet in an instant, a cold dread washing over him. This was not an infiltration. It was an invasion of the mind. The door to his chamber flew open. Kalen stood there, his face grim, a pulse rifle in his hands. "They're here," he said, his voice tight. "The null field is centered on the primary command nexus. They've shut down all internal communications. They're blinding us." Before Elian could respond, a wave of pure psychic force slammed into them, an invisible fist that buckled his knees and made Kalen stagger. It was not an attack of subtlety or precision. It was brute force, a battering ram of mental energy designed to shatter shields and overwhelm defenses. And it was aimed at Kalen. "He's after you," Elian gasped, clutching his head as another wave hit, weaker this time. Kalen was already moving, his expression a mask of cold fury. "Warlord is holding the nexus. We go to them." They ran through the stone corridors, the silence broken only by the sound of their own footsteps and the distant, muffled clang of alarms that were now purely mechanical. The psychic dead zone was disorienting, a sensory deprivation that left Elian feeling exposed and vulnerable. He could feel nothing but the cold, oppressive presence of the enemy asset. They reached the Nexus antechamber to a scene of carnage. Kalen's elite guards lay on the floor, not wounded, but still, their eyes wide and vacant. They were not dead. They were disconnected. Their minds had been wiped clean, leaving behind empty, breathing shells. In the center of the Nexus, Warlord and a handful of his men stood in a defensive circle, their faces strained with effort. And facing them was a single figure. It was clad in the same matte black biosuit Elian had once worn, but its presence was vastly different. Where Elian had been a void, this asset was a vortex, actively drawing the psychic energy of the room into itself. Asset 739. Elian could feel the cold, familiar signature of his replacement, but amplified, weaponized. The Directorate had learned from their mistake. They had not just created a ghost, they had created a psychic predator. Kalen, the asset's voice echoed in their minds, a cold, synthetic sound. The Directorate has re-evaluated your threat potential. You have been recategorized from a regional insurgent to a primary strategic threat. Surrender the stolen asset and your own termination will be efficient. Kalen raised his rifle, but Elian put a hand on his arm. Don't, he whispered. Physical attacks are useless. He's projecting a kinetic shield. He could feel it, a shimmering wall of pure force around the asset. He's using the minds of your guards as a power source. He's feeding on them. Kalen's eyes darkened with a terrible fury. He looked at his fallen men, at their blank, staring faces, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The asset turned its helmeted head, its dark visor fixing on Elian. Asset 734, the thought came, directed only at him. Your performance has been deemed substandard. You are scheduled for decommissioning. You have been contaminated by the target. Contaminated. The word struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. He had been contaminated by choice, by feeling, by a name. He looked at Kalen, at the fierce, protective anger on his face, and felt a surge of his own rage, hot and clean. My name, Elian projected back, his voice clear and sharp in the psychic silence, is Elian. He stepped forward, placing himself between Kalen and the asset. And you are trespassing. A flicker of surprise, of confusion, rippled from Asset 739. Emotion. An unplanned variable. The asset recalibrated. A focused beam of psychic energy, sharp as a laser, shot towards Elian. Elian didn't try to block it. He didn't shield. He did what Kalen had taught him. He filtered. He let the energy flow around him, parting it like water, letting it dissipate harmlessly against the stone walls behind him. It was effortless. It was like breathing. Asset 739 faltered, its cold, logical mind unable to process the maneuver. Shields were meant to be broken. Attacks were meant to be met with counterattacks. This quiet, calm absorption was not in its combat parameters. He is a barbarian, the asset projected, its focus shifting back to Kalen. An anomaly. He deals in chaos and emotion. The Directorate offers order, logic, a future free from the weakness of biology. It is quoting from the prime directives, Elian thought, a sudden, chilling realization dawning on him. It's not thinking. It's just a mouthpiece, a puppet. The weakness of biology. Kalen's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He took a step forward, placing a hand on Elian's shoulder. His presence was a warm, solid anchor in the cold, null field. Our biology gives us loyalty. It gives us fury. It gives us the strength to protect our own. What does your logic give you, little machine? The strength to turn a sister into a weapon, the order to erase a man's soul and call him an asset. Kalen's raw, emotional power, amplified by his rage and grief, surged through Elian. Elian didn't fight it. He embraced it, shaping it, focusing it. He had the precision. Kalen had the power. Together, they were something new, something the Directorate had never anticipated. "Let me show you," Elian projected, his mind now linked with Kalen's, their thoughts moving as one. He reached out, not with an attack, but with a memory. He pushed the image of Kalen's sister into the asset's mind. Not the blank-faced assassin, but the bright, laughing child from Kalen's story. He followed it with his own fragmented memories, the feel of grass, the sound of singing, the sad smile of a forgotten mother. He showed the asset the taste of hot stew, the feeling of the wind on the spire, the quiet comfort of a shared silence. He showed it everything it had been stolen from. He showed it a life. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a tremor, a single painful crack in the asset's cold, perfect facade. Parameter not found. A confused, terrified thought whispered from deep within the machine. Error. Cascade failure. The null field flickered. The kinetic shield wavered. The minds of the fallen guards stirred, a faint collective moan filling the nexus. Elian pushed harder, not with force, but with empathy. He showed the asset the image of itself, a lonely, empty vessel, a puppet whose strings were held by cold, distant masters. He showed it the possibility of a name. The asset staggered back, its helmeted head shaking from side to side. A high-pitched psychic scream erupted from its mind, a sound of pure, undiluted agony. It was the sound of a cage breaking, the sound of a soul remembering itself. The kinetic shield collapsed, the null field imploded, and the sound of the fortress rushed back in, a deafening roar. In that single, vulnerable moment, Kalen moved. He was not aiming for the asset. He raised his rifle and fired a single, precise shot at the ceiling. A massive, crystalline power conduit, cracked and damaged from the psychic assault, shattered. It fell, not on the asset, but in a glittering, deadly curtain between them, cutting them off. "We are not butchers," Kalen growled, his voice tight. "We do not kill the wounded." The asset, now just a terrified, confused person trapped in a suit, scrambled back, disappearing into the maintenance shafts from which it had come. The immediate threat was gone. Elian sagged against Kalen, the psychic exertion leaving him drained and shaking. Kalen's arm was a solid band of iron around him, holding him up. The guards on the floor were beginning to stir, groaning and sitting up, their minds their own again. Warlord rushed over, his face a mixture of relief and awe. "General, what was that?" Kalen looked down at Elian, his gaze intense. There was a new light in his eyes, a fierce pride that made Elian's heart ache. "That," Kalen said, his voice resonating with a deep, unshakable certainty, "was a choice. He had not killed the asset. He had not taken a prisoner. He had offered his enemy the one thing the Directorate would never allow, a chance to be free. And in doing so, he had affirmed everything Elian now fought for." In the aftermath, a strange, profound quiet settled over the fortress. The physical damage was minimal. A shattered conduit, a few scorch marks on the obsidian floor. The psychological toll was far greater. Kalen's guards, their minds briefly stolen and used as fuel, were shaken but unharmed, a testament to the fact that Asset 739's attack had been one of control, not annihilation. The escaped asset was gone, vanished back into the labyrinthine tunnels of the mountain. A hunt was organized, but Kalen called it off after a few hours. It is no longer an asset, he had declared to a confused Vorlag. It is a refugee. Let it find its own path. Our enemy is the Directorate, not its victims. The statement resonated through the command structure, a subtle but seismic shift in the ideology of their war. They were not just fighting against an enemy. They were fighting for something, for the liberation of all the Directorate's ghosts. Elian and Kalen stood in the Warlord's study, the river of lava below, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a new, quiet intimacy. They had faced the ghosts of their past together and had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. "It will return," Elian said softly, his gaze fixed on the molten flow. "The one I freed. It doesn't know how to be anything else. The Directorate is all it has ever known." "Perhaps," Kalen conceded, his voice a low rumble beside him. "Or perhaps it will find a new way." "You did." The simple words were a validation, a recognition of the impossible journey Elian had taken from a number to a name, from a weapon to a man. He had not just survived. He had been reborn in the heart of this mountain, midwifed by the very man he had been sent to kill. He turned to face Kalen, the dim, fiery light illuminating the harsh planes of the Warlord's face. The exhaustion was there, but so was a quiet relief, a softening around the eyes that Elian had never seen before. "Your sister," Elian said, the words feeling inadequate. "Tonight. I think we honored her memory." Kalen's throat worked, a flicker of profound, unguarded emotion crossing his face before his mask of control settled back into place. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping Elian's cheek. The touch was not one of ownership or dominance. It was a touch of reverence, of quiet wonder. His thumb traced the line of Elian's jaw, the same jaw he had once brutally dislocated. The gesture was a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. "Elian," Kalen murmured, his voice thick with an emotion Elian could not name. The sound of his own name, spoken in that low, resonant voice, sent a shiver through him. It was a sound of belonging. In the charged silence of the room, surrounded by the deep, steady hum of the fortress, the war outside and the battles to come seemed to fade away. All that existed was the space between them, a space filled with unspoken understanding, shared trauma, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Kalen's gaze dropped to Elian's lips. The air grew thick, heavy with a tension that was no longer about conflict, but about a deep, magnetic pull. It was the pull of two solitary souls who had found their mirror in the most unlikely of places, the pull of an alpha who had learned that true strength was not in control, but in liberation, and an omega who had learned that true freedom was not in solitude, but in connection. Elian's breath hitched. His heart, a heart he was only just learning to listen to, was hammering against his ribs. He did not pull away. He leaned into the touch, a silent, instinctual surrender that was also an act of profound courage. He was choosing this. Kalen's eyes searched his, asking a silent question, offering one last chance to retreat. Elian answered by closing his eyes, a gesture of absolute trust. He felt Kalen's breath warm against his skin, and then his lips. The kiss was not rough or demanding. It was slow, hesitant, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of ozone and grief, of victory and solace. It was a kiss that sealed a bond forged in violence and tempered in empathy. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air. The psychic space between them was calm, a quiet pool of shared thoughts and feelings. There were no more walls, no more shields. "I don't take prisoners," Kalen whispered, his voice a raw murmur against Elian's skin. The words, once a threat, a statement of brutal ideology, were now a vow, a promise. Elian opened his eyes, his slate-grey gaze meeting Kalen's winter blue. "I know," he replied, his voice steady and clear. "You don't." He was not Kalen's prisoner. He was not his asset, not his weapon, not his pet project. He was his ally, his partner, his. And he was, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly free. The war was not over. The Directorate would send more ghosts, more machines. The future was a path carved through a battlefield. But for the first time, Elian did not have to walk it alone. He had a name, he had a choice, and he had a home, built not of sterile white towers, but of dark, warm stone in the heart of a mountain, beside a man who had shown him that the greatest freedom was not the absence of chains, but the courage to choose your own. The lava river flowed on, a silent, incandescent promise of the fire within. And in the quiet chamber, two broken soldiers found a peace that was more profound than any victory.